Hey, Becky.
Welcome, everybody.
Okay, y'all, we're trying to contain the excitement, and I'm just going to be really blunt. It is very hard to contain the excitement in the room today.
We are in the presence of greatness, which is really
Yeah.
ironic because we're set up strangely today that we look like anchors,
We're
like
like,
news
we look like
anchors.
news anchors sitting
And
next to each
yet
other.
we have like the king of humanitarian news efforts with us today.
What a good parallel. That is exactly right. We're talking to Raj Kumar today. He's the founding president and editor in chief at Devex. And, for us, it was a first time learning about Devex in the last few months. And our heart has grown to understand that this exists. But if you think about the global development efforts, the humanitarian efforts happening around the world, 20-ish years ago, Raj looked around and said, there's no independent voice really speaking to this sector, to the people that are living and breathing and fighting on the front lines and raising money and all those aspects. And he built the table that he wanted to see in the world. And that is Devex today. And it is a powerhouse. He is an author that has read just a real thought leadership book in the space called The Business of Changing the World. And his pedigree is everything you would expect somebody leading at this effort.
I feel like he doesn't talk about it either.
I
like
know.
So humble. Raj, you're so great.
And that's more of the tone of this podcast too, because we want to hear about your story that led you here. And we know you spent time in India at a young age that really was formative. But Raj has just had incredible experiences in life. He's been on the ground at some of the most formative world changing moments. He's been part of the Clinton administration in the strategic capacity and journalist. So he has had just so many experiences threaded together. This is going to be an incredible conversation. And Raj, it is our honor to sit with you today. Thanks for being here.
So guys, the feeling is totally mutual. You are the best. I have had such a great time getting to know you and your organization, listening to your podcast. So I'm just delighted to be here and have this discussion with you.
Stick a fork in me. We're done.
Yeah. Wrap up shop. Well, Raj, okay, could you start us walk us through your story? I love the bravery that you showed and just standing up and saying, I'm going to do something that hasn't been done yet before because you saw the need. Would you kind of take us through your journey personally of how you love this sector and how you built this table?
I'd say bravery maybe is a good word, but also ignorance. Like sometimes not knowing is really helpful. Not knowing how hard something's going to be. I think had I known how tough it would be to start and lead Devex, I'm not sure I would have done it in the beginning. Things are often it's helpful being young and not knowing how the whole world actually works, and that benefited us in some ways. But you mentioned I spent some time in India as a kid. My dad was from there. As a kid, I got to go to India a lot when I was young. I had a lot of family there, and it just kind of opened my eyes to the realities of the world that we live in. Right, like I used to play soccer in this little village where I would go and my aunt and uncle lived and who I'd stay with. And I was the only kid who had sneakers, right? So we'd play in this kind of gravel field, and those things really stick at you, even when you're 5 years old or 7 years old or whatever. And so I always got this sense, and my sister did too, my older sister, that why does the world work this way? Why is it set up this way? And we had this really fortunate experience that I had an aunt and an uncle from India who had dedicated their careers as academics to studying poverty and global development. And so they would take us on visits to villages, and they would tell us about this world of global development, which, forget about most kids, most adults haven't really heard this term global development. It's kind of an insider's, industry term. But I got to know that it existed through my aunt and uncle when I was really young, and had a sense that I think this is the thing I want to work on one day, and I've been fortunate enough to get a chance to do that.
I think one of the most extraordinary things to me about interviewing people who steep their businesses in empathy and equities is they have these stories of being a child and they notice inequities. I mean, the story of understanding that you had privilege with your sneakers and not just noticing it, but having it trigger you and say, this doesn't feel good. This doesn't feel right. I want everybody to have sneakers. We should all be able to go out and play soccer together. And I love that thread followed you into Devex, which, I mean, people, Raj is connecting and informing more than 1 million global development professionals around the world with this content. So I am so excited about what you're doing. It is very Becky Endicott style of talking. It punches you. It kind of hits you square between the eyes with what you're saying. And sometimes you need to do that to get someone's attention. It's that scroll stopping content. We want somebody to click on it. We want them to click, and then we want them to activate and care. And so I would love for you to just give us kind of an overview of Devex, of your mission and your programs.
Yeah, and to me, these are the most important issues in the world. These are the issues that we shouldn't even have to jazz them up or dress them up. We're talking about, how the entire planet lives, how people, get through their lives, get ahead. When you think about things like climate change, whether as a species we're going to do well in the future, like these are the biggest issues in the world, in my opinion. And yet, as a news organization, we often find our reporter will be in the room at some UN hearing or some Capitol Hill event, and we're the only journalists there to talk about child poverty. Like somebody on stage saying, any journalists here want to ask a question, and there's one hand maybe, and that's not a good thing. We think these are the most important issues. We think people should be covering them, and that's why we get started. That's why we do what we do every day, which is to shed light through journalism on the most important issues in the world: climate, poverty, disease. Shed light on those issues, let people know what's happening, what's working, and what's not working too, to hold people and institutions accountable. The biggest institutions, the World Bank, USAID, the UN agencies, we're writing about what they're doing well, but also what they're doing that's failing. And I think the power of journalism brought on a subject like this is really significant. And that's what gets us up every morning, is this idea that we've got these sustainable development goals. Before that, there were the Millennium Development Goals, that kind of the goals for the whole world. Make sure no kid goes to bed hungry, make sure that there isn't this level of inequality and poverty in the world. And who's actually working on making sure we achieve those goals? And really, there's a whole industry built up around it. A lot of the big nonprofits, I'm sure plenty of people listening to this work at places like that, CARE and Oxfam and Save the Children and places like that. There's, of course, big philanthropies, Gates Foundation, Ford Foundation, and so many others, big and small. Then there's the government agencies. And if you add it all up, it's a huge industry. We think it's like bigger than $200 billion a year that goes into these kinds of global development efforts. And what we're trying to do is document all that, write about it, talk about it, make it clear to people, and really, hold us all accountable to actually achieving the goals.
I think the thing that I love the most about it, because I want to compliment you, because we were talking to CN Haldane with Monch in London a couple weeks ago about the SDGs and what the UN is trying to do to move the needle, and it just has to be a grassroots effort. That's what I took from that conversation. Is it's not on Devex, it's not on Monch, it's not on the UN. It's about all of us pulling together, and you are reporting right now in a history of the world unlike anything we've ever seen before. And I want to compliment your style of reporting, because it is so honest, which I think there is such a mistrust of media right now. And it's a massive problem. And I just see such transparency. These are the themes of development, what we want to do when we talk to donors, when we're trying to, connect missions with philanthropy. It's like you're doing it through your reporting. You're showing up authentically. You are transparently saying what it is. You're not watering down. And I just commend you, your reporters, the bravery. I mean, I don't know about you, John, but I have been watching the Afghanistan coverage like on a loop, just very stressed about it. And these reporters that are so brave, to women reporters who are walking out and getting this hard-hitting news. I mean, talk to us about this social enterprise and communicating and lifting up these stories in the middle of a time such as this.
Yeah, it's a pretty extreme time, right? And you look around the world, there's some crisis happening, everywhere. Obviously, we're living through a global pandemic. You've got Afghanistan, you got Haiti, which is living through multiple crises. There's a lot happening. And for us, part of the job is to make sure people are paying attention to those stories. And the other part is making sure they have context around them, because it's not always just enough to say, and you know this so well through all the various podcasts you've done and the issues you've highlighted. It's not enough to say, well, let's write a check and we're going to solve global poverty. It's not just about the donation. That's important. The funding is important, but then it's about what do you do with that money and who has a voice in it? And is the local community empowered to actually solve this problem on their own? Are we using the best evidence in the approaches to solve these issues? Or do we have, data to tell us whether what we're doing is working or not working? And all of those things are so critical. And if you look at the history of foreign aid and global development, there's a lot of mistakes. I mean, there's just so many mistakes that have happened over the years, and a lot of good too. But we feel like the key in a moment like this, when there's so much crisis and there's so many challenges, is to shed more light on it, to make sure we first do no harm. We first don't make things worse in some way. And at the same time, we get funding and money and voice to the people who really are closest to the problems and can help actually address them.
Well, I think, the people that listen to this show, we're wired to like want to help. And when these crises keep on popping up, you want to just plug in, you want to be involved. How, what kind of lens would you prescribe for people as a funder to really identify around the world, what is the type of organizations that are doing that work? What are the kind of checks and boxes that you'd want to look for? Because the marketing can tell you anything, right? And as journalists, I know that y'all cut through that. What do you think is most key for funders to be looking for these, solving these global issues?
I think nowadays what funders are really trying to do is get as local as they can. They want to go to the organization that really lives the issues, and the people who have that lived experience they bring to them. And not just people like ourselves living maybe thousands of miles away who care about it, but really getting as close as they can to the ones who are doing the work. So I see a couple of different trends happening. One is funders who are trying to seek out those local groups and directly fund them. And sometimes the amounts are small because these can be really local community groups for whom, $5,000 can be a life-changing amount of money. It can really affect the way they operate. The other thing I see is that these big international organizations are themselves trying to become more local. So their staff is generally becoming much more composed of people from the communities they're serving. Even their leadership in the organization at the country level or local level are more reflective. There used to be this idea of expat jobs in global development. You fly around the world, you get put up in a really nice house, you have maybe a car and a driver, and you have all kinds of services, and kids go to a private school, and it's a great setup, right? I'm not saying that's gone completely, but it's diminished a lot. Because the idea now is much as the corporate world has done, is to say the talent, the professionals who are out there to do this kind of work, they exist in the countries that we're trying to serve. And so I think what you see funders trying to do more and more is address this issue, where they say the sector we're working in, the development sector, the nonprofit sector, is itself an outgrowth of an unequal history, and is itself, top down in a lot of ways. And we've got to address that right in our own backyard if we want to address these bigger issues in the communities we're trying to serve.
Oh my gosh,
Wow.
I just learned so much right there.
I know.
And I think the thing that is so encouraging to me is, as disheartening as it feels right now in the world, I mean, the unbelievable suffering. We've been very stressed out about what's going on in Haiti. Thank you for mentioning Haiti. We've interviewed a couple people on the podcast who have organizations there, and the level of destruction is just devastating. But I also think your point about localizing and making things community-based is very exciting. And here's the thing it tells me is that it's no longer, we can no longer live in a society where we just have people who write checks. It is incumbent upon all of us to figure out, what is the issue around me? How do I pour into it from my corner of the world? And it's going to take, it's almost like the script has flipped, and grassroots is starting to become the thing that is creating movements, creating community, and moving issues forward. And I love that, because the accessibility of that means that anyone can jump in. And the way that the world is so digital now means that we are instantly connected to each other, and that community can have this very fast ripple that just expands. And having the information, correct information. I want to emphasize, when you have factual science-based information, or people on the ground talking to the issues, talking at the heart of people who are experiencing these issues, it changes the lens. It simplifies and it humanizes the story, which we talk about all the time on this podcast. So I'm loving this conversation. Yeah, please go ahead.
And I think it also helps to avoid making the mistakes I alluded to before, right? Like you talked about Haiti. In my book, I talk about the American rice program in Haiti, where the American government said, people are hungry in that country. They eat a lot of rice. Let's get rice from American farmers and let's ship it overseas and give it to people for free who are hungry, and help them out. And it sounds great at one level. It sounds very generous of the American government, the American people, to do this. But what they ended up doing was decimating the Haitian farmers, because the farmers, no longer had a market to sell their own rice, because rice was free. And today's Haitian rice market is way smaller than it was before we started all this generosity. And, Haiti has to import rice now, even though they used to, have a much larger amount, a much more abundant amount. So there's all these examples where when you don't go local, when you don't actually talk to the people you're trying to serve and say, hey, what would be useful to you? You can make really big mistakes. I also highlight in my book the whole theme around orphanages, right? Where people want to help. And orphanages are a way that it seems like a great way to help. And they can be in some cases, there may be examples, but they've also turned now into an industry. And so in some countries, kids who still have parents are pushed into orphanage life, and they're used as kind of props for fundraising. And I mean, there's horrible stories about it, but this is not like a small number of kids. This is in the tens of thousands around the world. And some governments have had to just ban orphanages because of the problem of money coming from well-meaning Americans, Australians, Europeans, and others who see these pictures and they see these videos, or they go traveling to these countries and think, I want to help. And they don't realize in helping, they're actually taking a kid away from their parents. So there's real reason to be local and to listen to people locally. It's not just that it's like the right thing to do. It is, but it also works better and it avoids mistakes. And I think it's kind of an essential ingredient if we really want to achieve those big goals. Like, we have to actually center the work with the people in the communities where they live, just like we would want in our own communities to have a voice in what's happening.
Well, I love that you dedicated part of your life to just documenting this and going through the process of writing a book. And from speaking to other authors, I know you had to just immerse yourself so deeply to do this. Would you kind of take us through, set the scene? Why did you decide to write this book, and kind of what is the key takeaways of what's affecting global development in our world today?
And give us the title, because I love it.
Yeah.
It's the business of changing the world. And, I got into this situation where I felt like I was just repeating myself all the time. I would go to even talk to my wife, or, just talking to my friends, going to events. And I'm like, I'm just saying a lot of the same stuff. I'm really interested in this stuff. And maybe I need to go through the process of actually putting it down on paper. And that process is pretty rigorous. It forces you to fact check everything. And I found some of the things I was saying, weren't exactly right. And once I actually looked into the facts and the details, and it forced me to really think through kind of where I thought this whole sector is going. Where does global philanthropy head from here? And so it was a lot of work, as I'm sure you've heard from other authors, but I think it turned out to be really useful to me personally, just to kind of ground my own thinking on what I consider a pretty important set of topics. And so to me, the book was a way to take stock of what I've learned in the last couple of decades since we started Devex, since I was a grad student, and we thought of this idea. And what it led me to realize is this kind of revolution that I thought was happening 20 years ago in global aid and philanthropy and development actually didn't happen back then. We were kind of wrong about it. Our timing was sort of off in a way when we were starting Devex, myself and some friends, and that is happening now. Like, it's right in front of us right now. And the interesting thing, we're very used to talking about industries going through disruption. Think about Tesla and Uber, how they're disrupting, the automobile industry. Or think about, Facebook and Craigslist and the websites like that, totally disrupting newspapers. But when it comes to nonprofits, we often don't think about ourselves as an industry in a way. And so this idea of like commercial disruption doesn't touch us in the same sense. And I think it really does, and I think that we're basically going through the same kind of radical disruption that these other industries have gone through that we're so used to talking about right now. And we better pay attention to it, because we can use this opportunity if we pay attention to it well.
Raj, okay, you're speaking.
I know. I'm so excited. We can't leave this topic. Keep going.
Because that may be what people think. It's just not the reality. And I love that you're speaking that into being. It's like, you can't live outside of this world that's not changing at this pace, which is why the nonprofit industry is so behind in a lot of ways. So thank you for speaking that with clarity.
And it just speaks to the need to stay current, to stay relevant, to embrace innovation, to make space within your budget, within your timeline for creativity, because, this is such a trigger word for John and I, but doing the same thing the way that it's always been done will not be effective in this day and age. And it also has a deafening, I think, counter effect where you're not listening if you're doing things the exact same way. And if we're going to continue to evolve, if we're going to continue to rise to what our for-profit peers, our entrepreneurial peers are embracing, then we have to come over and say, okay, the way that it's been done has gotten us this far, and we have very nicely grown, but I want to see some linear growth. I want to see a skyrocket in this time. And so what would be your suggestion to nonprofits right now? What are the opportunities that they could seize to kind of embrace this brave new world?
I mean, I think there's so much to talk about on this, Becky. I would just first of all bring up this concept of zero goals. So, there's different levels of ambition you can have. You can say, I want my nonprofit to double in revenue, or I want to hire more staff. But, think about zero goals as a way to examine how ambitious you're being. And zero goals are things like, I want to end all child marriage. The whole world, I think there should be no more forced marriage of kids. And that's a really big goal. It's a zero goal because, if you get to that state, there will be no more of that happening. You see a lot of zero goals around health issues because they're maybe a little bit easier to measure, like polio. We're close to the global eradication of polio. And zero goals are really compelling. People really sit up in their chairs when you talk about this stuff. It's like, this is something that, we can do, and then it will be over for the rest of the world, like forever. And there's only one disease in human history, smallpox, that was ever fully eradicated. But now there's like 7 or 8 more that we're close to, that like maybe in the next decade or so could get eradicated. So I think, first of all, we got to ask ourselves, are we being ambitious enough? Are we looking at these really big goals? It could be a zero goal. It could be something like you see in the Sustainable Development Goals. But if you're in this space, there's no point in being in it if you're not being really ambitious. That doesn't have to mean, I want to scale something globally. It could just be in your own neighborhood, right. But am I being ambitious enough about what I'm trying to do? Or is it a check the box activity? Is it like, we're going to keep going and do what we've done last year? And I think the world and the scale of the problems is just demanding more from all of us. And I think the market shift in our space is that it used to be enough to bring good intentions to the table and say, I just really want to help. And I have these great intentions. I think that's still really important, but that's not enough on its own. We now have to bring a much stronger focus on results. Like, is the thing we're out there to do, is it working? How do we know it's working? Are we honest with ourselves when it's not, and therefore pivoting to the things that might work? And I think we're being, really called to be much tougher on our own selves to make sure, as nonprofit leaders or as, international development professionals, that the work we do is the right kind of work. It's having the kind of effect we want it to have. And I'll just give one quick example, which is around this organization called Give Directly. I talk about it in my book as well. We cover at Devex all the time. It's a group of economists who said, why don't we just literally give money to poor people? Like, why are all these nonprofits set up to do education programs and health programs and agriculture programs? If we know these people are poor, why don't we just give them money and they won't be poor anymore? Right. And it's a very simplistic concept in many ways. And so people laughed at it at first. They sort of said, yeah, this doesn't work. If you give, poor people money, they're probably going to go out and spend it on alcohol and other vices, and you're not going to actually address these issues. And they said, but do we know that, or are we just assuming that? And so this group got together and they started very rigorously measuring this approach. They used satellite photography, and they went to East Africa, and they said, okay, if we find a village and a lot of the people have tin roofs, they must be doing okay. But the huts that only have, thatched roofs made out of grass, they probably have less resources. We'll target those homes, and through mobile money right to their cell phone, we'll give them $1,000, an unheard of amount of money in those communities. And then we'll really track what they do with it. And they did this. They did it really rigorously. And they found, actually some pretty positive effects. People weren't wasting the money. People were spending it on things that you and I would spend it on. They were making their homes a little bit better. They were spending on school clothes for their kids, on food to improve their nutrition. And so this concept started to grow. They got money from a couple of big foundations in Silicon Valley, including Google.org. And I think they've now given away more than $150 million directly to poor people. Now, it's not a panacea. And I think the folks over at Give Directly would say that themselves. This is not going to just solve everything. But it is kind of a call to action to all the nonprofits out there that don't do cash programming and instead do health or education or agriculture, to say, can you measure the results of your program and show that they are at least as strong, or ideally a lot stronger, than just giving away money? Because if you can't, then why don't you just give away money? Right? It basically brings a strong competitive element into the nonprofit space. where we might have before just sort of had a glossy brochure with pictures and said, look at the great work I do. There are a lot of smiling kids, they're happy. And now you have to say, well, Give Directly gets this impact when they give away $1,000. What impact do we get when we spend $1,000 on our program?
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, everything you're saying is threading together. And I think last season we talked a lot about dreaming big. That kept coming up in these conversations. And I feel like this zero goals is going to that next step. It's like, okay, we need to get out of the ethereal. We need to get down to what are we really trying to do and actually do that and make sure it's not to the detriment of a host of other things. I loved your rice example too. I don't think I got a chance to comment on that, but at what expense are our programs or whatever we think that we're doing positively? Is it happening downstream? Is it costing people their jobs, or is it costing the economic stability of a country even? I mean, that is such a powerful example and just connects it all together for me. So thank you so much for that.
And it's making me think of like Water 4, who everybody knows we just love so much, who is saying, no, we're here to eradicate the water crisis. That's our mission. It's as simple as that. We want you to put us out of business. And it wasn't just about give us donations so we can do it. It's like, we are going to teach the people in Africa. We're going to create an entrepreneurial program so they are driving their own business. They're creating businesses out of getting water to people. And it's not about putting a well in the middle of the village. It's about getting water in their houses. And I think about Harry Rosen. Have you heard the story of Harry Rosen? This is like a self-made millionaire from Orlando. He did exactly what you just described these economists do. And by the way, I believe in economists. Economists have the answers. I'm not surprised at all by this, but he literally went into an incredibly impoverished neighborhood in Orlando. And he said, Tangelo Park, I am going to take you on with my money. And all he did was provide free daycare for everybody. And he gave every kid a college scholarship. And the college graduation rate went from 25% to 100%. And house prices ended up quadrupling. And it's like, he didn't take, a nonprofit with his fancy brochure. He just, again, took his money straight to the source and said, I'm going to put it in these two problems. And bam, the community ended up thriving at a local level. So I guess what we're saying is everything you're saying is true. And we're drinking all of this Kool-Aid.
Yeah. And I wish it made it easy. There is no easy answer to it. There was a study Brookings put out, they kind of calculated to take every person in the world living in extreme poverty and get them out of that. And extreme poverty, by the way, your listeners, I'm sure know, but it's $1.90 or less. So if you make $1.90 per day, not per hour, per day or less, you are technically living in extreme poverty. It's a totally arbitrary number. Why is it not $2 or $2.50? Or it's arbitrary, but it gives you a sense of the extreme conditions that so many people live in. And right now it's about 1 billion people who are living in extreme poverty. It was quite a bit less than that before the pandemic, but a lot of people got thrown into it during the pandemic. And anyway, they had calculated at one point, it was like $66 billion a year. So if somebody could write a check that big, you could take all the people out of extreme poverty and put them into one, level above that, $1.91 a year or something. Well, it's just not that easy. Like who's going to write that check? How do you get it to people? How do you not distort?
Are you listening?
Right? But even if you did, right? How do you not you're going to have to do other kinds of things to make sure that people get that money, then can use it to get the food or the education or the healthcare services that they want. It's not that simple, but it is important to think in these terms, because otherwise it's easy to just have a nonprofit organization that's kind of going year to year. It has a good mission. It's, people care about what they're doing, but never really get to that point of showing the next level of results. And I think that's what we're all, given the crises today, I think it's how we got on this topic. I think the crises are so extreme now, we need to be thinking more ambitiously about how we get there.
I think something I've seen you write about is this global mindset. And I feel like you kind of described in your story how that was shaped at an early age too for you. Could you give some counsel to somebody that wants to cultivate that in their own life? I mean, we talk a lot on the podcast. It doesn't mean go fly and start building the house overseas. That's probably the worst thing you could probably do, right? But what are ways that we can cultivate a global mindset in the middle of America? We're in Oklahoma. How can we encourage our friends, our neighbors, our families, us to do that?
Well, I think so many of the issues we're talking about really are global. And the first thing to remember is whatever challenges you see in your own life or your own neighborhood or community, they're probably pretty similar. The scale might be really different, but people are pretty similar. And, if you're worried about your kids getting a good education, that's probably a very similar feeling that like a refugee family will have if they're fleeing Syria. Turns out that's actually true. If you talk to refugee families, a lot of their concerns are things like that. Will my kids get education right now while we're kind of on the move? We're in a refugee camp. What are they going to provide? And so oftentimes the first thing you can do is just realize that people are people and that these issues are pretty universal. The second thing is a lot of the biggest issues on our minds today are actually global issues, meaning even if you do everything right on climate change in your neighborhood, it doesn't really matter if the whole world is not going forward. It doesn't mean don't do it, but it just means that it's worth it to be thinking about how can my work actually impact this global issue beyond just working in my community. The same thing goes for something like the pandemic, as we're all experiencing, right? We can get vaccines and have a fantastic program in one little area and really address the virus here, but it's a virus. It doesn't respect borders, and variants can come from different places. And we need a global health system that has to be strong. We all know about healthcare in our own neighborhood, state, community. It's a big political issue in the U.S. Obviously, it's not just a national issue. Healthcare is a global issue. If a country does not have a strong health system in place, that's when diseases can crop up and cross borders and come. And we've just been reporting on a country in West Africa this week that had a case of Ebola and a case of Marburg disease. And because of the fact that they've got a better health system than before, in part due to the Ebola crisis, 5 or 6 years ago, they were able to find these cases and isolate and case and trace. And so an American who's sitting thousands of miles away might say, well, that's happened in West Africa. Who cares? Well, it can travel, right? If those countries don't have the right surveillance systems in place, you could get a global pandemic. So we're really in this. We're only as strong as kind of the weakest health system in the world, and that applies to so many other issues. And so my main advice, I guess, is to get that global mindset is to just think about the issues you care about, and you'll quickly see that there's a connection that connects to people everywhere.
And I think the bottom line is pour into what you're caring about. Yes, go follow them on social. Yes, make your year-end gift. But I think if we're going to follow the Raj Kumar, the challenge to us of rising to be incredibly ambitious, it's going to require us to do more than hit the like button, to hit the give button. We have to figure out how are we going to pour into it. And I think, even if you have nothing financially to give right now, your voice is an important space. I think the brand of who you are, how you show up in the world is a very important brand. You have something to say. You have a heart and a passion for something. Tell that story, bring somebody along, have them care with you. Put a call to action of I'm doing this. I'm writing a letter. I'm calling somebody. I'm calling my state legislator about this crisis and asking him what they're doing about it. To your point about climate change, it's like we have got to be pouring into this because it's something that's going to affect generations, and because a healthier world makes our local community healthier. So I'm just loving this conversation. And I just am curious with all of these wonderful stories that you have, and I honestly love every one of them. And I think people need to go get the business of changing the world and go buy that book because there's some really great stories in there. What is a story that you have heard either with Devex or maybe personally where you've seen philanthropy or humanity converge and it's just a story that sticks with you?
I mean, there's so many, and I get into a bunch of these in my book. One that I think a lot of people relate to when I tell this one is the Uber for tractors. So we all know Uber. They're huge now in most of the world. But somebody, a young man, he was working in banking. He did his degree in Georgia, was down in Florida. He was working in banking like a lot of young MBAs would, and he sort of thought, I don't feel like I'm having enough impact in the world. Like I'm not connecting to a mission. And he understood and had some experience in West Africa, Nigeria, that there was a big issue there where poor farmers couldn't get access to a tractor. And in fact, if you travel in many of these countries in the world, you'll see farmers are still using the same kind of tools that they used hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Just a hoe or basic materials to prepare their field for planting. It takes on average 40 hours to prepare a field for planting, and if you're using hand tools, and it takes 8 hours with a tractor. So 40 days if you're doing it by hand, and 8 hours with a tractor. So it's a huge difference, right? And this is why sometimes kids don't go to school, because they need their help in the fields, because it takes too much effort to do this sort of work. So this young guy, his name is Jahil Oliver. He said, well, why can't we use the same concept of ride sharing that we're using for cars here in America? Why can't we do that in a place like Nigeria for tractors? And, probably 20 years ago, he wouldn't have been able to do this for many reasons. Obviously, technology wasn't there, but also the whole nonprofit sector would have said, I don't know, who's going to grant money to this young guy with this idea, no track record really. And, we don't do grants that way. Plus, this is kind of a business. You have to do a technology investment. It's probably a for-profit model, a social enterprise. It would have just never gotten past the idea stage. But he did this in 2015. And, back at that point, there were some people ready to do kind of venture philanthropy and risk a little bit of money. And even the US government was ready to do tiered funding, where they say, we'll give you a small amount of money, $50,000 maybe, if you meet certain criteria. If you do really well with it, then we'll give you a few $100,000. If you do really well with that, then we can talk about even more. Long story short, Hello Tractor, it's what they're called, has now grown to be a major player in the provision of kind of an Uber for tractors platform. They've got 75% of all the new tractors in Nigeria use their technology, and they're in 5 countries in Africa. And the basic concept is, if you had enough money to own a tractor, now you get a lot more use out of it. People can borrow it from you. And you could even have a business doing like a fleet of tractors and getting them rented out. And if you don't have the money to have a tractor of your own, you can pay a small amount and actually get one for use. And it's the kind of thing that to me is really powerful, because the center of it is seeing that farmer as a customer. Not saying, hey, this is a really poor person and what can we do for them? How do we, give them food aid or something? Instead, it's saying, okay, what do you need? You need a tractor? Well, let's just find a way, a financial engineering way to get you one. You are a customer too. Even if the amount of money you have is really small, maybe it's enough to meet your basic needs. And building a business around that person as the agent of change in their own life, I think is a powerful concept, and one that I think shows me at least where we're kind of headed as a global development, as a nonprofit, as a philanthropy world. It's this nexus of seeing the people we're trying to serve as customers, as partners, not as just somebody in need.
Okay, we look like
What a
Cheshire
powerful
cats
story.
right now.
I know. We're like Googling Hello Tractors.
Which
of course.
casual Barack Obama is like quoted
Yeah.
at the very front. And it's like, Mr. Oliver, good on you, because you are so right, Raj. We are moving in this philanthropic sector, in this moment in time. We are moving away from, hey, we want you to give, to we want you to empower. Your gift can be a vessel to empowerment. Your gift is not something that just, provides funding. It's like getting somebody to figure out how to fish. We don't want to just give the man a fish. We want to teach him how to fish. And I have to tell you, I am here for it. And I am excited. I hope that this is the future of philanthropy, because I think there has got to be some space where venture philanthropy converges with very traditional philanthropy, which converges with major foundation giving. And I even think the part about federal funding, can you imagine putting a proposal together in the way that I have in my major gift days, thought about going to a foundation and asking for a major gift? The United States government, I would like to ask you for $50,000 for Hello Tractor. What a phenomenal story. I just love it.
And it's removing all the labels. Like, who cares how it's organized? Like, it's focused on solving the problem. We're all going to die someday, and preserving our nonprofit for the sake of being a nonprofit is not the worthy mission. It's trying to solve the actual big problem. So
and you don't have to put your name on it. It's not a building that you have to put your name on it.
Exactly.
It's like, give that up. We're purists. So of course I want someone to give that up, but it's like, yes, if the focus is on the one tractor, then that is the starting point. And I think if you're a nonprofit listening right now, picture your one. Who is your customer avatar? Who is your donor? Find that person and run your strategic goals through the lens of the one.
That's right. And not all the donors are there yet, but they're getting there, And so if you're a nonprofit that still thinks, well, my donors are moved by the photos, by the glossy pictures, by the human stories. Okay. Maybe some of your donors still are, and you can still do some of that. But just know that where donors are going is they want more than that. They want to see the evidence. They want to see the data, and that you've got competitors as a nonprofit who are out there telling a different story. And they're telling that story of using technology, of enabling customers, of really thinking in a different way about impact. And, nonprofits, I think, are going to have a shakeout, just like every other industry has had one. This sector will have one too, where some will do really well and grow, and some will actually go out. They'll go under. They won't be able to survive, unfortunately, but they won't if they don't change with the times.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. I'm just like so excited. This has got me all amped up. Raj, we end all of our episodes asking for your one good thing. And I honestly can't wait to hear what you're going to say. This could be a secret to your success or a habit that you've instilled. What resonates with you today?
I mean, the one thing that came to mind for me is a class I took a journalism class I took in college. And the professor showed us this video clip from the time of the Vietnam War. And it was, what you'd expect from an old newsreel from back then, right? There's a serious reporter in a kind of a safari suit, and he's standing in front of a trail of Cambodian refugees, and he's speaking in a really deep voice, and he's saying something like, one can only imagine what's going through the minds of these refugees. And the professor showed us this clip because he's like, this is the wrong kind of journalism. Like, what should this person do? Turn around and ask them. Just ask them what's going through their mind. You don't have to imagine. And I think we do a lot of that in the nonprofit, and especially in the global development sector, just given that so much of the work happens in places like sub-Saharan Africa, but a lot of the money and authority and power comes in places like the United States, right? We do a lot of this imagining what other people think or imagining what they might want. And the one good thing that I try to do is to remind myself, like, you got to listen a little bit more. Don't assume that you get it, that you understand all the context and you understand how it all works. Got to go out there and talk to that next source, talk to that next person, and just say, how are you seeing this from your standpoint, or what am I missing? And if you don't get that context, then I think you kind of miss the whole story. And that's what we as journalists at Devex, that's our job, is to get that story. So that's the thing I think everybody who works in the space can do more of, is just a little bit more listening.
Okay, I have to correlate that, because we had a major philanthropist on the show in season 1, given multi-million dollars to many organizations. And his one good thing was where he said the thing that development officers do poorly is listen. And so here we are again in this season where we don't need to be going and doing. And honestly, I think that we're just kind of hardwired to do that, because people in nonprofit are scrappy. They wear so many hats. They have so many tasks. They have such a small budget, and they're trying to accomplish so many. It's about stop. Listen, this is a really good tip. And I have to agree with what Julie Comfer is saying, that Raj, you exceeded the hype for what we had for you coming on the show.
I wish you could see our text thread.
I know
you're
just a great human being. I love the way that you look at the world. It's so nuanced and evolved, but it's also incredibly steeped in empathy and humanity. And I just picture like little Raj in his tennis shoes, like running off to go play soccer, and just thinking, I'm going to bring the shoes, I'm using my air quotes, the metaphor of shoes, to the world through my gifts. And so I'm just so grateful that you would come and hang in our space. So how can people connect with you? Where can they find you on social? How can they find Devex? Give us all the links.
All the things.
Book, for sure.
Yeah, well, I'd love to talk to people. You can find me on Twitter, Raj_Devex. You can find me on LinkedIn. Tell me what you think. Read the book and tell me, what I missed or got wrong, or what you're working on. I'd love to. And one of the best ways I learn about what's happening in our space, just hearing from people directly about what they're working on. Devex is a news platform. You can go to devex.com. You can read our content. You can subscribe to some of our newsletters. We've got a newsletter called the Newswire. It's sort of like the must-read newsletter if you're in the development space, in the global development space, and you want to know what's happening with the World Bank or the Gates Foundation or USAID. Like, this is the thing that our reporters are putting together every morning, and it's free, and you should check it out. It's called the Newswire, so subscribe to that. I think you'll find a lot of ways to connect with us once you're in the Devex community. We do all kinds of events around the world. We have all kinds of different content. We have a whole platform with 1 million development professionals who have registered their profiles on our site. So come and check it out, and tell me what you think when you find me on social.
And one last compliment. You have so much data at your fingertips, and yet your social is so still so human. You have faces on almost all of your socials. And to me, that connects it back to the stats. So brilliant hack. Absolutely love that.
This has been amazing. Thank you so much for being here and for all that you've done over the last, 20 plus years.
You're such a good human.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Becky. It's been great. Really nice to be with you all.